If you've been playing Final Fantasy XIV long enough, you've likely already seen or heard the terms FFLOGS, PART, or ACT. Essentially what they all mean is a method of measuring the output statistics of players during a fight. Howdy all, Wyrm here. Today I'm going to be discussing the history of ACT and FFLOGS in Final Fantasy XIV, as well as the effect they've had on our community. During A Realm Reborn, players were working hard. Everything was brand new and groups were just starting to venture into the binding coil of Bahamut. It didn't take long for a popular method of measuring player statistics to make its way into the game from other popular games that have similar rating scenes. The tool is a third-party application called ACT, standing for Advanced Combat Tracker. Simply put, this application measures every element of a fight from start to finish and outputs the data for players to view in real time or analyse later. In the beginning of its life cycle, ACT was primarily used to measure the DPS output or healing output in encounters. Players' main use for it was to measure their output for a combined DPS to see if everybody was performing as they should. The popular method at the time for the majority to measure this was simply looking at the output percentage of the party members. An example is, the DPS were expected to do most of the work, followed by the tanks, and then followed by the healers. However, back in A Realm Reborn, tank and healer numbers were measured, but were not taken as seriously as DPS roles. This method of tracking continued through the rest of A Realm Reborn. However, a new tool was released shortly before the end of the expansion. Its name? FFLOGS. I couldn't find exactly when FFLOGS released, or tied into ACT, but it was certainly in development during A Realm Reborn. But it didn't see wide use until Heavensward, which is when the player base as a whole were fully introduced to it. Before FFLOGS, players analysed data in ACT. However, it was harder to analyse. FFLOGS imports this data and lays it out in a much more efficient manner, and makes it easy for even a novice to analyse. Even then, it was mainly used as a tool to help players improve. But it wouldn't be long before the tool took on a whole new role for the raiding community. This role would have happened naturally, as we were already on that course. But it was the first raiding tier of Heavensward, Alexander Gordius, that accelerated this process. I'll be going into the full history of Gordius and the meta change in another video soon, so to keep it short, Gordius was much harder than raids that came before, and had fights that required much more DPS output from players, on top of the new mechanics and difficulty. These fights were brutal for so many groups that tried, that many couldn't cut it. ACT and FFLOGS began to be used much more frequently at this point, on top of the new meta changes which called for as much DPS output as possible, even from the tanks and healers. It's at this point the meta of how ACT and FFLOGS are used today was born. Groups became much more strict about the requirements for membership, and used FFLOGS to determine the worth of a player when recruiting. It's at around the same point where the community became divided. FFLOGS was being used incorrectly by many, who only cared about the percentage number of DPS a player did and were not looking at the rest of the stats. I'll put myself as an example when I used to tank. As my group progressed through Gordius, we were being held to strict requirements in terms of our DPS output, to the point my group only cared about my DPS, and my cooldown and mitigation throughout the fights barely got a passing glance. This was the meta that was forming, and it forced players to change with the times or be left behind. These meta changes, combined with ACT and FFLOGS that enforced them, caused a deep rift within the player base, that still exists to this day. This continued on until Stormblood, when things began to really change for the better. Players still focus on DPS as the primary, but we're also looking at the player's other stats more closely and weighing them more carefully. ACT and FFLOGS were having a more positive effect on the player base, however the negative aspects remained. Fast forward to today, and both tools are still used across the player base, and you would be hard pressed to find any max level player who doesn't either know of them or use them themselves. Now, neither of these tools are bad or evil. It's like the old saying goes, it's how they're used that determines that. Both tools are frequently used outside of established groups, as a way to discriminate against other players by people who use them incorrectly, focusing on a single stat rather than the whole. This is where the negative reactions and hate for these tools comes in. Many players view them as a medium for others to discriminate or unfairly judge others, especially since you don't have to use the tool yourself to have your performance recorded and uploaded for others to see and to judge you on. The player backlash due to this fact was so widespread, the developers of FFLOGS introduced a method for players to claim their character data on the website. They couldn't remove the logs, but could choose to have them hidden for public view. However, even this is looked on negatively, as the act of making one's logs private is viewed by many as a method of hiding one's poor performance, and hinders one's chances of joining a group. Both tools have become so intertwined with Final Fantasy XIV that they will more than likely be there even at the day the game comes to an end. Even for the detractors, they've learned to live with them, as they will always be there in some form or another, as they have been in other MMOs such as World of Warcraft. In the early days of ACT and FFLOGS, players talking about using the tool while in game would actually receive bans. It continued that anyone seen discussing these tools in game chat could get banned. However, we're at the point where SE has just unofficially accepted that these tools are here and don't do much broad enforcing of the rules. However, they still take uses of the tools as a method of discrimination very seriously, and will take action against anyone caught doing so. It's because of this, players will usually never mention ACT or FFLOGS in game chat, as it can easily be used against them in a report if another player feels that they're being harassed by the other player's actions. From my own personal point of view, both of these tools are very powerful and very helpful in improving performance. However, misuse of the tools still casts a negative light on them, and I personally have a mixed opinion on both, which differs depending on how they're used. Thanks for watching everyone. Please leave a like or a comment below if you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear your personal opinion on the subject. If you want to see my upcoming videos, hit that subscribe button. I have plenty of FF14 videos uploaded already, which you can check out on my channel. Thanks everyone, and have a good one.